The morning mist clung to the windows of Mel's Corner Diner like a shroud, obscuring the view of Chicago's industrial skyline that stretched beyond the cracked parking lot. Inside the dimly lit establishment, fluorescent lights flickered intermittently above worn vinyl booths, casting harsh shadows across the weathered face of Thaddeus Brennan as he hunched over his laptop computer. The device, a 4-year-old Dell that had once seemed like a luxury purchase during better times, now served as his only connection to the digital nightmare that had consumed his family's entire existence. For 3 weeks and 4 days, Thaddeus had maintained this ritual. Every morning at precisely 7:15, he would enter the diner, order a single cup of black coffee from Dolores, the 60-something waitress who had worked there for longer than anyone could remember, and settle into the corner booth that had become his unofficial office of desperation. The coffee would grow cold as he refreshed webpage after webpage, searching for any sign that CryptoVault, the cryptocurrency exchange that had promised to revolutionize his family's financial future, might somehow return from the digital void where it had vanished without warning. $847,312. The number haunted his dreams and invaded his waking thoughts with the persistence of a prayer repeated until it lost all meaning. 23 years of marriage, 2 decades of factory work at Westfield Manufacturing, countless overtime shifts, missed family dinners, postponed vacations, and every conceivable sacrifice had been distilled into that single devastating sum. Money that had represented security, retirement, college educations for his children, and the promise of a comfortable middle-class existence had simply evaporated into the ethereal realm of blockchain technology and digital wallets. The irony was not lost on him that his downfall had come through the very technology that was supposed to democratize finance and free ordinary people from the tyranny of traditional banking institutions. He had read articles about cryptocurrency's revolutionary potential, watched YouTube videos featuring young millionaires who had parlayed modest investments into generational wealth, and listened to his co-worker Donovan's enthusiastic explanations of Bitcoin's meteoric rise. When the Westfield plant had announced its closure 8 months earlier, taking with it Thaddeus's $62,000 per year position as a quality control supervisor, cryptocurrency had seemed like salvation wrapped in complex mathematical algorithms. The diner's bell chimed with its familiar off-key melody as the door opened to admit Cordelia Brennan, still wearing the navy blue scrubs that marked her as one of Chicago General Hospital's most experienced surgical technicians. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually immaculate appearance showed the strain of working 16-hour shifts while their world crumbled around them like a house built on sand. She carried a manila envelope that Thaddeus recognized with a sick feeling in his stomach. More bills, more notices, more legal documents that chronicled the systematic destruction of everything they had built together. Cordelia slid into the booth across from her husband, her movements heavy with exhaustion that went far beyond physical fatigue. At 49, she had maintained the kind of professional competence and emotional strength that made her indispensable in the high-stress environment of trauma surgery. Doctors requested her specifically for the most challenging cases, knowing that her steady hands and quick thinking could mean the difference between life and death for patients wheeled through the emergency room doors. But the crisis that had befallen her own family had tested reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "The mortgage company called again this morning," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the clatter of dishes from the kitchen where the breakfast rush was beginning to wind down. "They're accelerating the foreclosure timeline. We have until the end of next week to bring all 6 payments current plus penalties and legal fees. They're talking about a total of $18,000. Thaddeus closed his eyes and leaned back against the cracked vinyl booth, feeling the familiar weight of failure pressing down on his chest like a physical force. The house on Maple Street had been their pride and joy when they purchased it 14 years earlier, a modest 3-bedroom colonial with a small yard where Caspian had taken his first steps and Isadora had practiced violin scales that drifted through open windows on summer evenings. The mortgage payment of $1,347 per month had seemed manageable when his factory job provided steady income and overtime opportunities, but it had become an insurmountable burden since his unemployment began. "I keep thinking about that night in November," Thaddeus whispered, his voice cracking with emotion, "when I showed you the Bitcoin investment proposal and all those charts Donovan had printed out. You said we should keep at least half our savings in traditional accounts, that putting everything into one investment was gambling, not investing." Cordelia reached across the scarred Formica table and covered his trembling hands with her own. Her skin was cold and chapped from constant hand-washing at the hospital, but her touch still carried the warmth that had sustained him through 2 decades of marriage, 3 job changes, 2 miscarriages, and countless smaller crises that had tested their partnership. "We can't change what's already done," she said, though her own voice wavered with suppressed tears. "We have to focus on what happens next, on how we're going to take care of our children." The mention of their children brought a fresh wave of guilt crashing over Thaddeus like a cold shower. Isadora, their brilliant 17-year-old daughter, had maintained a perfect 4.0 grade point average throughout high school while participating in debate team, volunteering at the local library, and working part-time at a tutoring center to save money for college expenses. She had been accepted to 7 universities with various scholarship offers, including a full academic scholarship to Northwestern University that represented the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice. Now, even the most generous financial aid packages felt impossibly out of reach when they couldn't afford to keep food in their refrigerator. Caspian, their 11-year-old son, had been blessed with the kind of irrepressible optimism and natural intelligence that made him a favorite among teachers and classmates alike. He excelled in mathematics and science, showed remarkable talent for creative writing, and possessed an emotional intelligence that sometimes surprised adults with its depth and sensitivity. But lately, Thaddeus had noticed changes in his younger son's behavior, a hesitancy to ask for things he needed for school, a tendency to make his lunch last longer by eating smaller portions, and a premature understanding of financial constraints that no child should have to carry. The diner's bell chimed again, and Isadora herself entered the establishment, her backpack slung over her shoulder, and her usual bright demeanor subdued by weeks of watching her parents' mounting despair. She had been staying after school for extended study sessions and volunteer activities, partly to maintain her college application portfolio and partly to avoid the suffocating atmosphere at home, where every conversation seemed to revolve around their escalating financial catastrophe. "How did the scholarship interview go at DePaul?" Cordelia asked, forcing a smile as Isadora slid into the booth beside her mother. "Better than I expected, actually," Isadora replied, though her enthusiasm felt forced and hollow. "They were really impressed by my community service hours and my essay about using technology to address social inequality. But Mum, even if I get their full tuition scholarship, there are still living expenses, meal plans, textbooks, lab fees, transportation costs. The financial aid counselor said we're looking at least $12,000 per year in additional expenses." "Don't worry about that right now, sweetheart," Thaddeus interrupted, though his heart broke at the thought of his brilliant daughter potentially losing her chance at higher education because of his catastrophic financial decisions. "We'll figure something out. Maybe I can take on additional work, or we can look into student loans that don't require parental co-signing." But even as he spoke the words, Thaddeus knew they rang hollow. He had been unemployed for 8 months, surviving on Cordelia's hospital salary and rapidly dwindling savings that had now vanished entirely into the digital ether. At 52 years old, with skills primarily suited to manufacturing work that was increasingly automated or outsourced to countries with lower labor costs, his prospects for finding employment that could support a family and college expenses seemed impossibly remote. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Caspian, who appeared at their table as if summoned by their collective worry. He clutched a permission slip for a field trip to the Museum of Science and Industry, the $25 fee circled in red ink by his teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez. His usual boundless energy seemed dampened by weeks of hushed conversations between his parents and an atmosphere of tension that even his young mind could sense. "Dad, I know money's really tight right now," Caspian said hesitantly, his young voice carrying a weight that no child should bear. "But all my friends are going on this trip, and Mrs. Rodriguez says it's really important for our unit on renewable energy. She says they have this amazing exhibit about solar panels and wind turbines that could help me with my science fair project." The silence that followed felt deafening in its intensity. $25, an amount that would have been insignificant just months ago when Thaddeus's factory job provided steady income, now represented an impossible luxury that their devastated finances couldn't accommodate. He felt the familiar burning sensation in his chest that had become constant since CryptoVault's collapse, a mixture of shame, anger, and helplessness that threatened to overwhelm his ability to function as a father and provider. "Maybe next semester, buddy," Thaddeus managed to say, his voice thick with emotion that he struggled to control. "We're going through some really tough times right now, but I promise you that things are going to get better. This is just temporary." Caspian nodded with the kind of forced understanding that children often display when confronted with adult problems they can't fully comprehend. But Thaddeus saw the disappointment flash across his son's face before he masked it with practiced resignation. The boy trudged back toward the diner's entrance, leaving his family to confront the harsh mathematical reality of their new existence, where every expense, no matter how small, required careful consideration and often painful sacrifice. The next morning brought no relief from their mounting crises, only fresh reminders of how quickly a middle-class existence could dissolve into financial chaos. Cordelia had already departed for work before dawn, hoping to pick up additional shifts in the emergency department, where her expertise in trauma care was in constant demand. The overtime pay provided crucial additional income, but it also meant longer hours away from home and increased stress that was beginning to take a visible toll on her health and emotional well-being. Thaddeus found himself alone in their kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of their former prosperity. The granite countertops that Cordelia had selected with such care during their kitchen renovation 3 years earlier now seemed like monuments to their past financial security. The stainless steel appliances that had been wedding gifts from both sets of parents hummed quietly, oblivious to the fact that the electricity powering them might be shut off within days if they couldn't bring their utility payments current. He opened his laptop and began his daily ritual of refreshing the CryptoVault website, even though he knew it was an exercise in futility that only deepened his sense of helplessness. The domain now displayed nothing but a generic error message, and his attempts to contact customer service had yielded nothing but automated responses that had grown increasingly sparse before stopping altogether 3 weeks earlier. The phone number listed on their original investment documents had been disconnected, and the physical address in the Cayman Islands led only to a mail forwarding service that claimed no knowledge of the company's operations. Online forums dedicated to cryptocurrency investing buzzed with theories about the exchange's sudden disappearance. Some users insisted it was the result of a sophisticated hack by international cybercriminals. Others claimed it was a coordinated attack by traditional financial institutions threatened by Bitcoin's growing popularity, and a few conspiracy theorists suggested government intervention designed to discredit alternative currencies. But as Thaddeus read through hundreds of posts from other victims, a more disturbing picture began to emerge. CryptoVault had likely been operating as an elaborate Ponzi scheme from its inception, using new investors' deposits to pay withdrawal requests from earlier participants, while the founders systematically siphoned funds into offshore accounts beyond the reach of American law enforcement. The sophisticated trading algorithms and military-grade security features that had impressed Thaddeus during his initial research were probably nothing more than elaborate theater designed to mask a criminal enterprise that had defrauded thousands of ordinary investors seeking to secure their financial futures. The realization that he had been the victim of a deliberate fraud rather than a market crash or technical failure brought a new dimension to his anguish. He hadn't simply made a bad investment decision. He had been systematically deceived by criminals who had studied his hopes, fears, and aspirations with the precision of psychological predators. The testimonials and success stories that had convinced him to invest his family's entire savings had likely been fabricated. The impressive returns displayed on his account dashboard had probably been fictional, and the sense of financial security he had felt while watching his Bitcoin balance grow had been nothing but an illusion designed to keep him invested until the scheme's inevitable collapse. Isadora discovered him in this state when she returned from school that afternoon, slumped over his laptop with his head buried in his hands. She had spent the day attempting to focus on her advanced placement courses, but the weight of her family's situation made concentration nearly impossible. Her teachers had begun to notice her distraction, and her guidance counselor had asked several times if everything was all right at home. The question felt impossible to answer honestly without revealing the full scope of their financial devastation. "Any news from the forums or the attorney websites?" she asked, though she could tell from her father's posture that there wasn't anything encouraging to report. "Nothing good," Thaddeus replied without looking up from the screen. "I've been reading stories from other families who got caught in similar situations. Some of them lost even more than we did, their entire retirement accounts, money they had saved for medical emergencies, funds they had set aside for their children's education. There are people who mortgaged their homes to buy cryptocurrency, families who cashed out their life insurance policies, elderly couples who converted their social security payments into Bitcoin. Isadora sat down beside her father and studied the forum posts he had been reading, her teenage mind struggling to process the scope of the criminal enterprise that had destroyed so many lives. The stories were heartbreaking in their similarity. Middle-aged workers who had lost manufacturing jobs and seen cryptocurrency as a path back to financial stability. Retirees who had been convinced to move their 401k balances into digital currencies. Young families who had been persuaded that traditional saving was obsolete in the digital economy. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you about the Northwestern Scholarship," Isadora said carefully, choosing her words with the precision she typically reserved for debate competitions. "I called their financial aid office yesterday to discuss our situation. They said that even with the full academic scholarship covering tuition, room and board, I would still need approximately $15,000 per year for books, lab fees, personal expenses, and transportation home during breaks." Thaddeus looked up sharply, his bloodshot eyes focusing on his daughter's face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Isa, Northwestern is your dream school. It's one of the best computer science programs in the country. Do you understand what this opportunity could mean for your entire future?" "I understand what it should mean," she replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Dad, with everything that's happening with our house, with your job search, with Mum working double shifts just to keep us afloat, I can't ask you to take on more debt for my education when we can't even afford groceries." "No," Thaddeus said firmly, gripping his daughter's shoulders with a desperation that surprised them both. "You are going to Northwestern, or DePaul, or wherever you decide you want to go. I don't care what I have to do, what jobs I have to take, what sacrifices we have to make. This crisis is my fault, my responsibility, and I will not let my mistakes destroy your future." But even as he spoke the words with passionate conviction, Thaddeus felt the crushing weight of reality pressing down on his promises. He had been unemployed for 8 months despite sending out hundreds of applications and attending dozens of interviews. The few job offers he had received paid less than half his previous salary and offered no benefits, making them insufficient to support his family's basic needs, much less college expenses for his daughter. The manufacturing sector that had provided middle-class employment for generations of American workers was contracting rapidly as companies automated production processes or relocated operations to countries with lower labor costs. At 52, with a high school education and 20 years of experience in a declining industry, Thaddeus was competing for positions against younger workers with technical skills he didn't possess and educational credentials he had never needed during his factory years. That evening, the family gathered around their dining room table for what had become their nightly crisis management meeting. The mahogany table had been a 10th anniversary gift they had purchased during flush times when overtime, pay and steady employment had made such luxuries feel reasonable and justified. Now it served as a staging area for overdue bills, legal documents, and the increasingly desperate calculations that governed their daily decisions about which expenses they could defer and which demanded immediate attention. Cordelia had managed to bring home leftover sandwiches from the hospital cafeteria, a practice that had become routine as their grocery budget evaporated along with their savings. She distributed the meals with the same clinical efficiency she brought to her medical work, but Thaddeus could see the toll that their circumstances were taking on the woman who had once taken enormous pride in preparing elaborate family dinners from scratch. "I had a long conversation with your sister Evangeline today," Cordelia announced as they ate in the kind of subdued silence that had replaced their formerly animated dinner conversations. "She's been asking us to visit Phoenix for years, and I'm starting to think maybe it's time we seriously considered relocating to Arizona." Thaddeus paused mid-bite, his sandwich suddenly tasting like cardboard in his mouth. "Leave Chicago. Start over completely in a city where we don't know anyone except your sister. The cost of living in Phoenix is significantly lower than here," Cordelia continued, her voice taking on the measured tone she used when explaining complex medical procedures to worried family members. "Evangeline says the job market is much stronger, especially in logistics and technology. The housing costs are about 60% of what we're paying here, and there are no state income taxes in Arizona." "What about my senior year?" Isadora asked, though she tried to keep any accusation out of her voice. She understood that their options were severely limited, but the thought of abandoning everything familiar during such a crucial period felt overwhelming. What about my college applications, my letters of recommendation, my extracurricular activities? What about my school? Caspian added, his eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. What about my friends? What about Little League season starting in the spring? Phoenix has excellent schools, Cordelia said gently, reaching across the table to squeeze both children's hands. And Evangeline has 2 teenagers herself, so she understands what you're going through. She says there are lots of opportunities for young people in Arizona, especially in technology fields. Over the following days, the idea of relocating began to evolve from desperate fantasy into concrete planning that consumed their every waking moment. Thaddeus researched employment opportunities in Phoenix's rapidly growing logistics sector, where companies like Amazon, FedEx, and UPS were establishing major distribution centers that required experienced supervisors and quality control specialists. Cordelia explored the process of transferring her medical certifications to Arizona, discovering that her trauma experience would be highly valued in Phoenix's expanding healthcare system. The more they investigated their relocation options, the more feasible the move appeared from both financial and professional perspectives. Arizona's lower cost of living would stretch their limited resources much further, while the state's business-friendly environment was attracting companies that offered the kind of employment opportunities that had vanished from the Rust Belt manufacturing economy. But the hardest part of their planning process was confronting the full scope of their losses and the changes that relocation would require. Beyond the cryptocurrency disaster, they faced foreclosure on their house, potential repossession of both cars, and the complete destruction of the credit rating they had spent 2 decades building. The life they had constructed in Chicago was crumbling so comprehensively that starting over in a new state began to feel less like running away from their problems and more like their only viable path forward. Isadora threw herself into researching Arizona's educational opportunities with the same intensity she had once devoted to her college applications. She discovered that Arizona State University had developed a nationally recognized cybersecurity program that attracted students from around the world. Her growing interest in digital security, sparked by her family's cryptocurrency disaster, began to coalesce into potential career paths that could help protect other families from similar financial predators. "I've been reading about blockchain forensics," she told her parents one evening as they reviewed relocation cost estimates. "It's a field where investigators trace cryptocurrency transactions to identify fraudulent schemes and recover stolen funds. If I studied computer science with a focus on cybersecurity, maybe I could help law enforcement agencies track down people like whoever ran CryptoVault." Thaddeus felt a complex mixture of pride and guilt at his daughter's words. Her resilience and determination to transform their family's tragedy into a force for social good reminded him of why he had fallen in love with education and learning during his brief attendance at community college, before economic necessity had forced him into factory work to support his young family. The logistics of their relocation proved daunting in their complexity and financial requirements. They would need to sell their house quickly, likely at a significant loss, given the local real estate market's weakness and their approaching foreclosure deadline. Both cars had outstanding loans that exceeded their current market value, meaning they would need to negotiate with lenders or face repossession regardless of their decisions. Most challenging of all, they would need to coordinate Cordelia's job search in Phoenix with their departure timeline to minimize the period without any income. Evangeline, Cordelia's younger sister, had been remarkably supportive when they explained the full scope of their financial crisis during a series of long-distance phone conversations. As a divorced mother of 2 teenagers working as a dental hygienist in Phoenix, she understood financial struggle with an intimacy that made her empathy both genuine and practical. Her small 2-bedroom apartment couldn't accommodate their entire family for an extended period, but she offered her couch and floor space as a temporary landing pad while they established themselves in Arizona. "Family helps family, especially during times like these," Evangeline had said during one of their planning calls. "You've always been there for me when I needed support, Cordelia. Now it's my turn to help you get back on your feet." The weeks leading up to their departure became a blur of difficult decisions about possessions and priorities that had accumulated over 20 years of middle-class life. Everything they owned had to be sorted into 3 categories: essential items that would justify the cost of transporting them to Arizona, valuable items that could be sold to fund their relocation, and everything else that would be donated to charity or simply abandoned. Thaddeus found himself confronting physical reminders of their former prosperity at every turn, each decision feeling like another small death of their previous life. The power tools in his garage, that had once been the pride of his weekend woodworking projects, now commanded premium prices on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace. Cordelia's jewelry collection, accumulated through birthday and anniversary gifts over 2 decades of marriage, became a source of desperately needed cash through visits to pawn shops and gold-buying services that offered a fraction of the item's sentimental value. The children handled the systematic dissolution of their material world with remarkable grace, though Thaddeus could see the emotional toll it took on both of them as they watched their childhood disappear box by box. Isadora carefully packed her academic awards, honor society certificates, and college acceptance letters, artifacts of achievements that now felt like relics from someone else's life. Caspian methodically selected his most treasured books and toys for the journey west, displaying a maturity that broke his parents' hearts as he accepted that most of his possessions would remain behind in Chicago. 5 days before their scheduled departure, Thaddeus received an unexpected phone call that momentarily lifted his spirits before plunging him into even deeper despair. The caller identified himself as Marcus Hendricks, an attorney specializing in cryptocurrency fraud cases, who had obtained Thaddeus's contact information from a database of CryptoVault victims who were organizing a class action lawsuit against the exchange's operators. "Mr. Brennan, I want to be completely transparent with you about the prospects for financial recovery," Hendricks explained, in a measured, professional tone that suggested he had delivered similar news to hundreds of other victims. CryptoVault appears to have been operating as a sophisticated Ponzi scheme for at least 18 months before its collapse. The perpetrators moved the majority of investor funds through a complex network of shell companies and offshore banking arrangements that will take years to trace and recover, assuming we can recover them at all. "But there's some realistic chance we might get at least part of our money back?" Thaddeus asked, gripping his phone with desperate intensity while his family gathered around him to listen to the attorney's assessment. "There's always a possibility in cases like this," Hendricks replied carefully, his words chosen with the precision of someone who had learned to manage victims' expectations. "Federal investigators have frozen some domestic assets associated with the scheme, and we're working to establish a victim compensation fund that could provide partial restitution. But I need you to understand that even in the most optimistic scenarios, cryptocurrency fraud victims typically recover only 15 to 30 cents on the dollar, and the legal process can take 3 to 5 years to resolve completely." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Hendricks explaining the legal process in detail, the timeline for potential recovery, and the costs associated with participating in the class action lawsuit. By the time Thaddeus hung up the phone, he felt more defeated than hopeful. The slim possibility of partial recovery years in the future felt like another cruel joke in their ongoing financial nightmare, offering just enough hope to make their current suffering more acute. He shared the attorney's assessment with his family that evening as they finished packing their remaining possessions into boxes and suitcases. Cordelia listened with the same stoic acceptance that had carried her through the worst phases of their crisis, occasionally asking practical questions about legal procedures and timelines, but displaying no emotional reaction to the remote possibility of eventual compensation. "It doesn't change anything about our plans," she said, when Thaddeus finished summarizing the conversation. "We can't put our lives on hold for years waiting for a lawsuit that might recover a fraction of our losses. We have to move forward with the assumption that the money is gone forever and build our future accordingly." Their final night in the house on Maple Street was spent on air mattresses in their empty living room, surrounded by the echoes of 20 years of family life and shared memories. The walls displayed pale rectangles where family photographs had hung until the previous week, and the hardwood floors bore indentations from furniture that had been sold or donated to generate funds for their relocation. Caspian fell asleep between his parents, while Isadora lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to memorize the way streetlights created familiar patterns through windows she would never see again. The drive to Phoenix took 4 days, with the family camping in budget motels and eating fast food meals that further strained their remaining financial resources. They had managed to sell Cordelia's car for enough money to cover their relocation expenses, But Thaddeus's aging pickup truck was loaded beyond its recommended capacity with their essential belongings. Every mile westward felt like another step away from their former lives and toward an uncertain future that held equal measures of hope and terror. Somewhere in the endless wheat fields of Kansas, as the summer sun beat down mercilessly on their overloaded vehicle, Caspian asked the question that had been weighing on everyone's mind throughout their journey. "Dad, when do you think we'll be able to go back to Chicago? When will we be able to go home again?" The silence that followed was broken only by the steady hum of truck tires on asphalt and the labored sound of their overworked engine struggling with its heavy load. Thaddeus met his son's innocent eyes in the rearview mirror and saw a trust and optimism that he knew would soon be tested by the harsh realities of their new circumstances. "We're not going back, buddy," he said as gently as possible, his voice thick with emotion he struggled to control. "Phoenix is going to be our new home, our fresh start. And who knows, maybe we'll discover that we love it there even more than Chicago." "Forever and ever," Caspian pressed, his voice small and uncertain in a way that made Isadora reach over to take his hand. "For as long as it takes us to build a new life and create new memories," Cordelia answered, when Thaddeus found himself unable to speak. "And I have a feeling that once we get settled, we're going to find opportunities there that we never would have had in Chicago." The landscape gradually transformed from Midwestern farmland to Southwestern desert as they continued their journey, and with each passing mile came a strange mixture of loss and possibility. They were driving toward the unknown, carrying nothing but each other, and the hard-earned knowledge that financial security was far more fragile than they had ever imagined. But they were also moving toward a future that remained unwritten, full of potential for redemption and renewal that their current circumstances couldn't diminish. Evangeline met them at her apartment complex in a working-class neighborhood of Phoenix, her warm embrace providing the first genuine comfort they had experienced in months of crisis and uncertainty. She was 5 years younger than Cordelia, with the same determined eyes and strong jawline, but a more weathered appearance that spoke to her own struggles as a single mother working multiple jobs to support her family. Her modest two-bedroom apartment would be cramped with 7 people, but she had prepared for their arrival with characteristic efficiency and generosity. Air mattresses had been arranged in the living room with military precision, and she had stocked the refrigerator with enough food for their first week while they oriented themselves to their new city and began the complex process of rebuilding their lives from scratch. Her own teenagers, 15-year-old Paloma and 13-year-old Diego, welcomed their cousins with genuine enthusiasm that helped ease the transition for both Isadora and Caspian. "Welcome to Phoenix," Evangeline said as they unloaded their meager possessions from the pickup truck, while neighbors gathered to offer assistance and curious glances. "It's not much compared to what you're used to, but it's home now, and we're going to make this work together." That first night, as the two families shared a dinner of homemade enchiladas and fresh salsa around Evangeline's small kitchen table, Thaddeus felt something he hadn't experienced since CryptoVault's collapse, a sense of community and belonging that transcended their financial circumstances. The apartment filled with laughter and animated conversation for the first time in months, and he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build something better from the ashes of their former life. The magnitude of their challenges became apparent over the following weeks, as they attempted to navigate the complex process of establishing residency in a new state while dealing with the ongoing fallout from their financial catastrophe. Phoenix's job market was indeed more robust than Chicago's Rust Belt economy, but Thaddeus's age and limited technological skills put him at a significant disadvantage in a city increasingly dominated by logistics companies and technology firms that valued adaptability and digital literacy over manufacturing experience. He spent his days filling out applications at warehouse complexes and distribution centers scattered throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area, quickly learning that even entry-level positions required skills he had never needed during his factory years. Computer literacy, inventory management software, and automated systems monitoring were now basic requirements for jobs that had once relied primarily on physical strength and attention to detail. Cordelia began the bureaucratic marathon of transferring her medical credentials to Arizona, a process that involved multiple examinations, background checks, and fees that strained their already depleted resources. The Arizona State Board of Medical Examiners required documentation from every institution where she had received training or certification, creating a paper trail that stretched back to her original certification program 25 years earlier. In the meantime, she managed to secure temporary shifts at an urgent care clinic in a strip mall near their apartment, earning significantly less than her Chicago position, but providing some desperately needed income while they waited for her permanent certification to be approved. The work was less challenging than her trauma experience, but it offered the flexibility to attend job interviews and handle the countless administrative tasks required to establish their new life. The children adapted to their radically changed circumstances with the remarkable resilience that young people often display in the face of upheaval that would devastate adults. Isadora enrolled at Phoenix Community College using a combination of financial aid and her deferred Northwestern scholarship to cobble together enough funding for courses that would transfer to a 4-year university. She found part-time work at a computer repair shop near the campus, where her natural aptitude for troubleshooting and her growing knowledge of cybersecurity made her a valuable employee despite her limited experience. Her supervisor, a patient Russian immigrant named Dmitry, who had rebuilt his own life in America 20 years earlier, recognized her potential and began teaching her advanced programming techniques during slow periods. "In my country, we say that steel is made strong by fire," he told her one afternoon as she worked through a particularly challenging coding problem. "Your family's troubles will make you stronger than people who never face difficulties." Caspian started 6th grade at a local public school, where his Chicago accent and unfamiliarity with Southwestern culture initially made him the subject of curious attention from classmates who had never lived outside Arizona. But his natural friendliness, academic ability, and genuine interest in learning about his new environment soon won over both teachers and students. Within a month, he was thriving in his new school and had made several close friends who helped him adjust to the cultural differences between the Midwest and Southwest. The cramped living conditions in Evangeline's apartment required careful coordination and mutual respect from all 7 residents. But the extended family gradually developed routines that maximized their limited space and privacy. Thaddeus worked night shifts as a security guard at a pharmaceutical distribution center, earning a fraction of his former salary, but providing stable income that allowed them to contribute to household expenses and begin saving for their own apartment. The work was far removed from his manufacturing background, involving long hours of walking through climate-controlled warehouses and monitoring security cameras for signs of unauthorized activity. But he approached the job with the same methodical attention to detail that had made him a valued quality control supervisor, and his supervisors quickly recognized his reliability and work ethic. 3 months after their arrival in Phoenix, Thaddeus received another call from Marcus Hendricks, the attorney handling the CryptoVault class action lawsuit. Federal investigators had made significant progress in their investigation, resulting in arrests of several individuals connected to the exchange's operations and the seizure of assets that could potentially fund victim compensation. "The news is cautiously optimistic," Hendricks explained during their conversation. "The FBI has identified and frozen several domestic bank accounts containing funds that appear to be connected to the CryptoVault scheme. Additionally, they've arrested 2 individuals in Miami who appear to have been operating the exchange under false identities. While it's still early in the legal process, we're now looking at the possibility that victims might recover somewhere between 20 and 40% of their losses. That would be life-changing for us," Thaddeus said, his voice barely above a whisper as he processed the implications. Even 20% of their losses would represent enough money to secure their own apartment, purchase reliable transportation, and provide a financial foundation for rebuilding their stability. "I want to emphasize that this is still very preliminary," Hendricks cautioned. "These cases typically take 3 to 5 years to resolve completely, and there are no guarantees about the final outcome. But the fact that law enforcement has made arrests and seized tangible assets is much more encouraging than what we usually see in cryptocurrency fraud cases." The attorney's update provided the first genuine hope they had experienced since their crisis began, but it also highlighted the long timeline they faced for any meaningful resolution. Years of uncertainty stretched ahead of them, during which they would need to rebuild their lives, without knowing whether any compensation would eventually materialize. Thaddeus shared the conversation with his family that evening as they gathered around Evangeline's kitchen table for dinner, a ritual that had become the anchor of their daily routine in their new life. The reaction was more measured than he had expected. Months of disappointment and setbacks had taught them to view any positive news with cautious skepticism. "It would be wonderful if we eventually got some money back," Cordelia said carefully, her medical training evident in her logical approach to uncertain outcomes. "But we can't plan our lives around something that might not happen for years. We need to keep building our new life, as if that money will never come, and anything we eventually recover will be a bonus." As spring arrived in the Sonoran Desert, bringing temperatures that would have been considered summer heat in Chicago, their new life began to take more definite shape and structure. Cordelia's Arizona medical certification finally came through after months of bureaucratic delays, and she began working full-time at a trauma center in downtown Phoenix. The position paid slightly less than her Chicago job, but offered excellent benefits and opportunities for advancement in Arizona's rapidly growing healthcare system. The steady income allowed them to start looking for their own apartment, though they would need to continue sharing some expenses with Evangeline for the foreseeable future. They found a modest two-bedroom unit in a complex near Caspian School with a small pool and playground that made it feel more like home than the cramped quarters they had shared for months. Isadora's computer science courses were exceeding her expectations, and her natural aptitude for programming had caught the attention of several professors who encouraged her to consider transferring to Arizona State University's nationally recognized cybersecurity program. Her work at the computer repair shop had evolved into increasingly complex projects, and Dmitri had begun teaching her advanced security techniques that weren't covered in her formal coursework. "You have gift for this work," he told her one afternoon as she successfully repaired a customer's laptop that had been infected with particularly sophisticated malware. "But more important, you have motivation that comes from understanding why this knowledge matters. That will make you better than students who learn only for grades." The legal proceedings against CryptoVault continued to progress through federal court, with periodic updates from their attorney providing glimpses of hope mixed with reminders of the complex legal process ahead. Additional arrests had been made, including the apparent mastermind of the scheme who had been living under an assumed identity in the Bahamas. More importantly for the victims, investigators had succeeded in tracing and freezing additional accounts and real estate holdings that could potentially be liquidated to fund a more substantial compensation pool. Thaddeus had gradually earned promotion from security guard to shift supervisor at the pharmaceutical distribution center, bringing both increased responsibility and modestly better compensation. The work remained far removed from his manufacturing background, but he had discovered that his experience in quality control translated surprisingly well to the logistics and inventory management challenges of modern distribution operations. His supervisors appreciated his attention to detail and ability to train new employees, qualities that had become increasingly valuable as the company expanded its operations to serve Phoenix's growing population. For the first time since leaving Chicago, he began to feel that his skills and experience had genuine value in the modern economy. 1 year after their arrival in Phoenix, the family had accumulated enough savings to move into a larger apartment in a better neighborhood, complete with their own bedrooms and a small patio, where Cordelia could pursue her long-time interest in gardening. The apartment was still smaller than their Chicago house and lacked many amenities they had once taken for granted, but it represented a crucial milestone in their recovery from financial devastation. More importantly, it felt like theirs in a way that Evangeline's generously shared space never could. They were no longer refugees from their former life. They had become residents of their new one, with growing roots in a community that was beginning to feel like home. The legal resolution of their cryptocurrency losses came 18 months later, in the form of a settlement agreement that exceeded even Hendrix's most optimistic projections. Through a combination of asset recovery, plea bargain negotiations, criminal restitution orders, and insurance claims, the Victim Compensation Fund was able to return 42% of investors' documented losses. For the Brennan family, this translated to approximately $356,000, enough to completely transform their financial situation and provide a solid foundation for their future in Arizona. The settlement announcement came on a Tuesday afternoon, while Thaddeus was at work and Cordelia was finishing her shift at the hospital, leaving Isadora to be the first family member to read the official email from their attorney. She immediately called both parents with the news, her voice shaking with emotion as she read the settlement details over the phone. The family gathered at their apartment that evening, staring at the official legal documents with a mixture of elation, disbelief, and cautious optimism that reflected their hard-learned wisdom about the fragility of financial security. "It's really real this time," Cordelia whispered, her eyes filling with tears for the first time since their crisis had begun 2.5 years earlier. "We're actually going to be okay. Better than okay. We're going to be secure." The money arrived 6 weeks later, after final paperwork was processed and verified by the court-appointed administrator overseeing the Victim Compensation Fund. The family used a portion of it to secure a larger apartment with a 2-car garage and small yard, and to purchase reliable vehicles that would serve them for years to come. But the majority was invested in a diversified portfolio of traditional savings accounts, certificates of deposit, and conservative mutual funds that reflected their hard-earned education about risk and financial planning. The experience with CryptoVault had taught them lessons about investing and financial security that would influence their decisions for the rest of their lives. They would never again put all their eggs in one basket, no matter how promising the potential returns might appear. Isadora was able to transfer to Arizona State University's main campus as a junior, where she pursued a double major in computer science and business administration with a concentration in cybersecurity and financial technology. Her professors were consistently impressed by her practical understanding of cryptocurrency vulnerabilities and digital security challenges, knowledge that had been earned through her family's painful experience rather than academic study. She became involved in research projects aimed at developing more secure digital payment systems and regulatory frameworks that could protect ordinary investors from the kind of sophisticated fraud that had devastated her family. Her senior thesis examined the psychological techniques used by cryptocurrency scammers to exploit victims' hopes and fears, research that was later published in a peer-reviewed journal and cited by federal regulators developing new investor protection guidelines. Caspian thrived in his Arizona middle school, where his academic performance and natural leadership qualities made him a standout student among both teachers and classmates. The experience of his family's financial crisis had given him a maturity and perspective unusual in someone his age, and he began expressing serious interest in studying economics and business administration as preparation for a career in financial regulation or consumer protection. "I want to help make sure that what happened to our family doesn't happen to other people," he told his parents during one of their evening conversations. "I want to understand how money and economics work so I can help build better systems that protect families like ours." The legal victory against CryptoVault became something of a landmark case in cryptocurrency regulation and enforcement, establishing important precedents for victim compensation and corporate accountability in the rapidly evolving digital asset industry. Thaddeus was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee investigating cryptocurrency fraud, where his articulate description of his family's experience helped shape new legislation requiring better disclosure and security standards for digital currency exchanges. But perhaps more significant than the financial recovery or legal recognition was the profound transformation that their ordeal had wrought within the family itself. The crisis that had initially threatened to destroy them had ultimately revealed reserves of strength, resilience, and mutual support that none of them had known they possessed. They had learned that true security came not from investment accounts or digital wallets, but from the bonds between people who refused to abandon each other during times of crisis and uncertainty. 3 years after arriving in Phoenix as financial refugees carrying nothing but their love for each other and determination to survive, the Brennan family had rebuilt their lives with a foundation more solid than anything they had possessed during their prosperous years in Chicago. Thaddeus had been promoted to operations manager at the distribution center. Cordelia had advanced to senior trauma coordinator at the hospital, and both children were excelling academically while developing career plans that reflected their family's experience with financial fraud and recovery. The settlement money provided financial security and peace of mind, but their own efforts and mutual support had created the stability and sense of purpose that defined their new life in Arizona. They had discovered that their greatest investment had never been the Bitcoin that vanished into cyberspace, but rather the time, love, and unwavering commitment they had made to each other's welfare and future. On a warm desert evening in late spring, as they gathered around the dinner table in their comfortable apartment overlooking the mountains that ringed Phoenix, Thaddeus looked at his family and realized that losing everything had taught them what truly mattered. The cryptocurrency that had promised to revolutionize their financial future had indeed changed their lives, though not in any way they could have anticipated. In the end, the most valuable currency they possessed couldn't be stored in digital wallets, traded on exchanges, or stolen by sophisticated criminals. It was the unbreakable bond between family members who had weathered the worst storm of their lives together and emerged stronger than they had ever been before.